Story 1. My brother had 3 gold teeth. They were ripped out in the first few months of being in prison. He said he lost them in a fight, but a guard told us that he was probably held down and had them forcefully pulled out, judging by the damage to his gums. Story 2. I did my time from 2018 to 2022. Being Asian, there are so few of us on certain yards, and I ended up being cellmates with the only other Vietnamese person on the yard. He was a lifer who was never going home and took me in like a little brother. I usually got mail from family, but one time I saw a letter that was for him. Excited to hand him the letter, he was in shock that it was for him. As he read the letter, his face said it all, and it was clear that it was not a good letter. He later told me that he reached out to his uncle to find out his mom and dad's whereabouts because they were in Vietnam. His uncle told him to drop dead, said he was an embarrassment to the family, brought him to the United States just to ruin his life, and told him to never contact them again unless he was getting released. He barely spoke any English and overall was a good guy who made a grave mistake. He had a huge drug addiction that I overlooked until it got out of hand. During count time, we had to stand up and show our identification to the correctional officers who were making their rounds. My cellmate would tell me when he was going to load up and shoot up the drugs. I had no problem with it because I am not one to judge, and this is how it is in prison. As long as I knew he wasn't snooping through my personal belongings, was respectful to the house, and not tampering with my hygiene, everything was good. But this time, as he got squared away, he didn't clean up, and I had already dozed off before. Count time. 4 or 5 loud knocks woke me up for count time. I jumped off the rack and noticed my cellmate was literally slumped over the stool like you see homeless people strung out on heroin. The correctional officers knew exactly what was going on but chose to look the other way rather than typing up a disciplinary report. I looked over at our table, and there it was. A gram of heroin, a syringe, a cotton ball, and a spoon. That alone can land you up to 5 to 10 extra years in prison plus dead time in the secure housing unit. After that, I tried explaining to him that if he didn't clean up his act, I was going to have to move out of the cell. I wanted to make it home, and he couldn't let go. Fast forward 2 or 3 months later, friends on the yard were telling me how my ex-cellmate was. Very sad and didn't act the same. He had no family support, letters, or phone calls, so I took him in as family, took care of him, and let him talk to my mom on the phone since we were from the same area in Vietnamese. That way, he could have some sense of family. COVID-19 struck the world, and inside prison it was absolutely a hellhole. We went through 4 to 5 months of straight lockdown with no phone calls or mail coming in or out. We had no clue what was going on because the correctional officers were all afraid, calling off work and refusing to take the vaccination. Some took it, some didn't. Long story short, my cellmate ended up being patient 0 and had COVID first on the yard. He was completely isolated in a different unit alone with other people who also caught the virus. A typical day in the prison compound, an alarm went off while we were all in lockdown. Everyone thought it was a fight breaking out in a different unit. 3 or 4 hours later, a correctional officer came up to my cell. I thought it was a cell extraction and braced myself to get raided. He pulled me out and told me that my ex-cellmate was found dead. He braided the bedsheets, looped them between the air conditioning unit, dropped to his knees, started spinning his body until the circulation cut off, and committed suicide. My heart broke in half and I cried in the cell. Of course, some people in prison are cruel and made fun of the matter. I ended up confronting one guy in the break room for making fun of my cellmate's suicide and got 6 months in the secure housing unit along with extra time for inciting a riot. An additional year along with the 6 months of dead time. I found out that they resuscitated him back to life. He was dead for about 25 minutes and has been in a medical yard on life support for the past 2 years. The state cannot pull the plug unless the family gives permission to end life support, but they tried to contact him, too little, too late. I pray for his soul and his family's well-being to this day. Rest easy, brother. Life after death will be graceful, and may you be reunited with your family when the time calls. Story 3. Hanging out one day in the law library, a young man came in quietly and started reading. One of my friends, who had been locked up for over a year and was in for cocaine dealing, suddenly got up, approached the young man, and severely assaulted him. The attack was brutal, with blood everywhere. The victim was on the ground while the assailant continued until the young man's face was severely injured. I stepped back to avoid getting involved when the correctional officers arrived. They removed the unconscious young man and handcuffed the assailant. I saw the assailant once more before my release and asked what had happened that day. He simply said, "I felt like hurting someone." Since then, and throughout my time incarcerated, I have struggled with trust issues. Witnessing an 18-year-old get beaten so severely was deeply traumatic. Story 4. When I was young, in juvenile detention, I was 15 or 16 at the time. Most of us there were older teenagers. An 11-year-old kid was brought in for throwing rocks at one of his teacher's homes. There was an older, overweight guard who worked there. These were generally civilian guards, given we were juveniles. This guy, named Travis, started acting strangely with the kid. First, the kid was like any other 11-year-old happy-go-lucky. Travis became very handsy with him. At meal times, he was actively rubbing him. We all saw it. It was a lockdown facility, so we weren't let out of our cells much, but we all witnessed it. The guard was rubbing his back and touching his leg. Within a few days, the kid's whole attitude changed. We all knew Travis was molesting him, even though we couldn't prove it. Story 5. I went to county jail for about a week in the middle of nowhere, Kansas, on a drug charge. I was 19 years old, scared stiff. It was a room with about 4 communal picnic benches and 2 rooms on either side with about 6 bunks in them. I noticed one was full and the other had just one guy in there. Not understanding the situation at all, I went over to the empty bunks, and a guy grabbed my shoulder and gave me a hard look that said, "No," without saying a word. Then I noticed the other prisoners were camped out in corners on their mattresses. I did the same. I found out quickly that the solo guy was in for a crime against a child. I have never heard such an ass whooping that night. I just covered my ears and stared at the wall, wondering how I got here. There was sobbing and pleading. I was bonded out the next day. This was in 1992, my spring break of college freshman year. I was driving to visit a friend of mine in Wichita. I never had to serve time. First offense, good lawyer, college kid, etc. I got extremely lucky. Story 6. I knew a man who was never in trouble in his life. He worked in the automotive industry in Michigan and lost his job. He fell behind on child support payments and ended up serving time in jail. On his very first night, his 2 cellmates got into an argument because one of them couldn't find his bear claw snack. They finally stopped arguing and went to sleep. In the middle of the night, he was woken up by one man beating the other, whom he accused of theft. He literally beat the man to death. Apparently, he had gotten hold of some kind of pole or stick. The entire cell was completely covered in blood. They later found out that the man accused of stealing did not steal it after all. I'll never forget the fear and look in his eyes when he told me what happened. Story 7. As a child, I went to juvenile detention for accidentally setting some woods on fire during a bonfire that got out of control. My cellmate was only a few years older than me. He was a very nice, laid-back person. We got along well and even became friends while there. I was just a child, so I didn't ask questions about different colors of jumpsuits or the reasons people were there. The day I was released, I found out he was serving time for murder. Apparently, he had become tired of his stepfather physically abusing him and ended up killing him. I never knew all the details, but when talking to him, he seemed like a good person at heart. He had things and people he cared about, goals and interests. The guards obviously knew, but they were always especially kind to him, noticeably more so than to other inmates. I have always wondered what happened to him. This took place in Florida during a severe drought, and we were already dealing with many fires intentionally set by arsonists. The authorities took the situation very seriously. 2 kids I considered friends pinned the entire incident on me. I definitely learned my lesson. He was very cool, polite, and got along with everyone. I couldn't imagine his experience being enjoyable, but I only knew him for that brief time. Story 8. A 57-year-old man serving a life sentence was high on synthetic psychoactive cannabinoids, crawling on the floor and screaming because he saw his deceased mother towering over him, looking at him with disgust. This is not a pleasant sight. especially when you are confined in the same cell. In another case, a 22-year-old man, also using the same drug, flooded his cell, set it on fire, and killed himself 2 months before completing his sentence. In a separate incident, a man severely injured himself and set fire to his cell because the drug made him believe that erections were evil. Therefore, avoid synthetic psychoactive cannabinoids. Story 9. A 17-year-old boy lived in my neighborhood. His name was Israel. He had been kicked out of his grandmother's house a few months earlier for using drugs, so he was living on the streets. He was arrested for package theft. He was only in custody for 30 days, but he enjoyed every minute of it. Because he was young and generally a good person, others looked out for him. I taught him how to play spades. At the end of the 30 days, he did not want to leave. He did not want to return to life on the street without food. He planned to do something to get himself back into custody, but I tried to convince him that was not where he wanted to be. I told him he needed to talk to his grandmother, stop using drugs, and try to find a job to help her pay bills and keep himself out of trouble so he could have his own place soon. He heard me, but I doubt he was really listening. If I had to guess, he probably got himself locked up again, but I hope not. Story 10. I knew a man who was very kind and in prison for just a parole violation because he stole something. He was homeless. He was a bit goofy and had schizophrenia or something, but a really nice man. Anyway, he was sent to segregation for some reason, and the guards ended up beating him to death there. I believe the guards who did it are in prison now. I can't believe that happened. Rest in peace, Larry. Story 11. A man we worked out with discovered that his father killed his wife, mother, and their child, then killed himself. He was in his cell for a while, and after about 40 minutes he was screaming for help. He stumbled out of his cell with his wrists and neck severely cut. Unfortunately, he did not make it more than a few steps before falling and becoming unresponsive. That was almost as traumatic as when my best friend's brother shot himself in the back of the head in the room next to us. Story 12. Not a prisoner, but I worked in a prison for about 2 years as an administrator. A lot of sad things happen all the time. Many times, the inmates' family visits turn into big shouting events, and the inmate goes back to their room feeling depressed because that was the first time in months they had seen their family. There was one time when a man was waiting for his mother and sister to visit him. The family had booked a half-hour time slot, and the man was in the waiting room, but they never showed up. I actually saw tears in his eyes as the visiting hours ended and he was told to go back. Our prison also conducts General Certificate of Secondary Education English and Mathematics classes for inmates. One of the inmates had been doing a lot of revision and preparing for his exams for almost a year, I assume. On the day of his exam, he heard that his partner had committed suicide, and he was mentally traumatized to sit for the exam. He lost his partner, missed his chance to appear for the exam, and lost a bit of his mind as well. There are countless small stories that I have seen, which are extremely sad. When I narrate this to people, there is very little sympathy towards them. Story 13. My ex-boyfriend was in jail for almost 3 years. I used to visit him every Saturday. There were many families in the visitation room. Imagine a sort of warehouse with small tables and chairs. There was a woman who would sometimes visit her husband and give him inappropriate favors under the table. Sometimes she would sit on his lap and stay there for a while. Right next to her were 2 little kids. I will never forget those kids' faces, staring at the wall, trying to ignore what their parents were doing. The guards mostly ignored it because the man was apparently a powerful drug dealer with a lot of influence. It was absolutely disgusting and humiliating for those kids. My ex would scold me for staring at them with disgust because he did not want to get in trouble with that man. So messed up. It is not as messed up as other horror stories, but it broke my heart to see kids in those situations. Story 14. I wasn't exactly in prison, it was the county jail. I used to have a bit of a drinking problem and landed a driving under the influence charge. It was a rural Wisconsin county, so about 90% of the inmates were there for alcohol-related offenses. One man was in there for his 4th operating while intoxicated charge, but he had been sober for 20 years. He got arrested because he had throat cancer and was spaced out on his pain medication when he was pulled over. The cancer had destroyed his larynx, and he had to use an electronic voice box to talk. There was a problem with the paperwork for his cancer medication, so the person in charge of the cell block wouldn't let him have any of it for the first few days. He was vomiting everywhere, and the rest of us inmates had to take care of him and clean up after him. Eventually, they sorted out his medication, and he served the rest of his time, about 2 months. 3 weeks after he was released, we saw his obituary in the paper. We also had a nurse who came around to give everyone their medication in the morning and evening. She quit because the officer in charge of the jail was constantly reprimanding her for being too kind to the inmates. She was a sweet young woman, relatively fresh, out of college. She believed that since we were already at a low point in our lives, we deserved some kindness. But the officer disagreed and gave her a hard time whenever he could. I think the incident with the man who had cancer was the last straw for her. Story 15. There was a person who went to prison and cried all the time. He never spoke, but after a while, it became clear that the officer forced him to confess that he had killed someone. Otherwise, the officer threatened to harm his sister in front of him. He confessed and received a life sentence. We are in a very conservative country. Story 16. I was working in the servery, so I was out of my cell every day all day. One day, I was told by the officer to check the cells on the ground floor. I opened one of the door flaps, and there was a man standing in the middle of the room with his shirt off, crying. He then proceeded to slash both of his wrists. I called for help and he survived. But not long after, he hanged himself. Story 17. I have been to prison and seen a lot, but one thing that has always stuck with me happened in holding at Franklin County in Columbus, Ohio. Back when I was an addict, you would get booked downtown. You would be in a holding cell with about 20 guys in a small room, waiting overnight until you could be moved to the other jail. We were all there for about 8 to 12 hours. The entire time, there was a guy chained to a bench designed for handcuffing people. It was just on the other side of the cell window. They had him tangled up and handcuffed to it. He wore a spit mask, a mesh hood that covers the entire face to prevent spitting on officers. Randomly, officers walked up to him and sprayed mace into the mask. They did this for hours. It was terrible. The kid was beyond crying. He was covered in vomit, mucus, and blood leaking from the mask everywhere. I have no idea what the young man did, but it was terrible to see. He was there the entire time I was there. During that time, we all had access to the restrooms and were fed twice. It may not sound that bad, but I have witnessed horrible things during my time as a homeless addict, and this is one of the moments that always stuck with me. Story 18. Not an ex-correctional officer, but an ex-correctional officer. Had an inmate who received some bad news. His mother passed away right as it turned Christmas Day. It was midnight and we wouldn't be serving food for a while. The day rooms were clear of inmates, so it was unusual to have to escort a guy down to the lieutenant's office. I was dismissed as soon as we arrived, and he was sent back alone. This guy was a troublemaker, always disrespectful to both staff and other inmates. When he returned, I thought I would have a hard time putting him back in. Instead, he calmly walked back to his cell, never said a word, and didn't look around. We checked on him multiple times, and nothing happened during my shift. I found out when I returned the next day that he had hung himself in his cell with a towel while his cellmate was at recreation and the officers were busy in another wing. I remember the worst part was getting the call to escort him down because when they called, it had just turned from Christmas Eve to Christmas Day. So for Christmas, he spent another night in prison and lost his mother. Story 19. During COVID-19, we were on lockdown frequently, so phone use was unreliable. I heard a man on the phone talking to his family, asking about his mother who had contracted COVID-19. His family told him she had passed away. He couldn't believe it because he had spoken to her 2 days earlier. The anguish and the way he broke down on the phone was heartbreaking. He couldn't even stand up anymore. Story 20. I was once stood up for a visit. My friend booked it and didn't show, so I had to wait in the holding cells while everyone went on their visits. After an hour, a guy from my area came back from his visit looking visibly shaken and upset. He told me that his girlfriend, the mother of his children, had just told him she had terminal cancer. Sadly, she died not long after. This was about 12 years ago. To make matters worse, The guy's face appeared on my Facebook recently because he was murdered. It made me think of the children, possibly adults now, left parentless. Story 21. The worst thing I have seen in prison was a gang brutally attacking a young inmate. They cornered him, beat him savagely, and slashed him with a knife. His screams echoed through the yard, but no one intervened. By the time the guards arrived, he was dead. The indifference and brutality of that moment still haunt me. I could have stepped in but would likely be in the same position. Story 22. In Everglades Correctional Facility near Miami, a person was placed in solitary confinement for a positive drug test. He witnessed a white inmate being assaulted by another inmate against the door, screaming for his life. At night, no one came to help. I still hear his screams. Story 23. There was a man in the yard who was convinced he would be transformed into a chicken for his crimes later in life. It was really crazy. Story 24. I knew an inmate who signed a power of attorney to his wife so she could handle his assets, business, and pay for his defense. A week after he sent the letter, she cashed out all his accounts and disappeared. He was also a detainee with U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, so he was almost certainly deported with nothing to his name. He was a nice guy too. His bunkmate had a seizure one night, and he kept him stable and from falling until staff responded. Story 25. There was an old Italian man who transitioned from using a cane to a wheelchair during the 4 years I was there. He was hunched over, had palsy, was half blind, and had Bureau of Prisons paid inmate caretakers to watch over him. This is common in federal prison and is considered one of the best-paying jobs. He was in his early 90s and dying from cancer. The federal authorities would not grant compassionate leave because he had been an important capo in the mafia back in the late 1970s. I do not remember his name. Then there was a man, maybe in his early 30s, probably high-functioning autistic. He had no friends, which is difficult in prison, and spent all his time listening to Catholic masses on the radio. He used his free time walking the track or in the leisure library, always listening to the radio. During visitations, his mother, who came every time as far as we could tell, would pet him. She would stroke his arm, hair, or back. You could tell it was very comforting for both of them. The guards permitted this, looking the other way for this man. We all knew he was a sex offender, but the prison culture was different. Even if not, those who prey on the helpless were at the bottom of the hierarchy. This man was truly helpless, and no one felt anything more than pity for him. Story 26. I was with someone, let's call him Carlos. He was up for review, serving a 10-year sentence, and he got a new roommate who tried to assault him. Carlos had no choice but to defend himself, which added another 5 years to his term, delaying his likely release that year. From what we understand, he told the guards and the review board that he was defending himself from assault, but the outcome was that he received more time. Update. I didn't realize how many likes this got. Thank you all. I asked my friend who stayed in the same block with Carlos about his release date. Carlos did get out on time in 2017. The new roommate had a reputation and multiple disciplinary actions in his paperwork for other assaults in prison, which affected his review. Update. I was serving 3 to 5 years for conspiracy to commit fraud and aggravated assault. I ended up serving 2 years in Arizona for good behavior and participation. I didn't do it, the lawyer failed me. But Shawshank Redemption. Story 27. I lived with a man who had spent some time in prison in Florida. He witnessed 2 people throw another man headfirst off a balcony. The man landed right beside him. His skull fractured open, and blood splattered everywhere. The man said he had nightmares ever since. I got the sense that this was the only story he felt comfortable sharing. Story 28. Had a stint in juvenile detention during COVID-19. A 13-year-old girl was the only other person I could talk to since her intake day was the same as mine due to social distancing protocols. Her story was intense. She was there because of a brutal fight with her drug-addicted mother. She had 2 choices: lose her only family member to jail and go into foster care, or lie and take the blame so she would be the one locked up. Her story genuinely almost brought me to tears. She had many cuts and bruises. Story 29. There was a man whose girlfriend broke up with him while he was inside. Just before we walked out to go to lunch, he had slit his wrists. His cellmate had to explain to the officer that he did it to himself. Edit, wow. I can't believe this gained so much attention. I appreciate all of the upvotes. I have many stories from being inside, some funny and others very depressing to think about. Story 30. I might be too late for this to be seen, but I have one story that was pretty messed up. This happened in jail where they held people with and without sentences, so there were guys there doing time. Anyway, this new white guy came on the unit. There weren't many white guys there, so he naturally came over. He introduced himself, said he was a barber. Okay, cool, there weren't any white barbers, so it would be cool to get some discounted cuts. I'm mentioning race because it matters later, and in there, it wasn't a big deal until it was. I thought the guy was weird. He was oddly quiet and had huge, deep, long scars going up and down his arms, but he cut hair, so whatever. A couple of days went by, and I was on my way back from church with an older guy and a young Hispanic kid. The kids said they had paperwork on the new guy and were going to violate him over it. He was telling me all this, and I was like, "Guy, we both happen to be white, but I don't represent that dude. If you have paperwork, show it to the guys and do whatever." I told some of the other guys and left it at that. Later that night, his cellmate set him up to be in the cell, and 3 guys, white, Hispanic, and black, went into the cell after him. They beat him badly. He had a hole in his cheek where you could see his teeth through. The guy said okay when they were done and said he had to go to the hospital. They said, "No, stay inside because if the cameras show them going in and him coming out messed up, they would put it together." He said no, he had to go because he was really hurt. They thought about it and told him to pretend he got hurt another way, like playing basketball or falling down the stairs. He said okay. We were almost at check-in time for the night, like 5 minutes away, and I saw the guy come out of the cell. He had all his stuff like he was going to shower, but had a hand towel draped over his head so you couldn't see his face. I was on edge, 1, because I knew what happened, and 2, because I knew he wasn't showering with 5 minutes left. I was on the bottom tier watching him trying to figure out what he was doing. He got to the top stair and literally threw himself down the stairs. These stairs are all metal and connect the first tier of cells to the second tier above, about 1 story high. He caught the edge of something because he was going down the stairs end over end, and his head kept banging the stairs as he went down. It was a weird sound. He hit the last few stairs, finished his rotation, and landed headfirst on the concrete floor with the loudest smack I've ever heard. Nobody moved. Everyone had an idea of what was going on. So only one older guy who didn't interact with us ran over to him, took one look, and started yelling for the correctional officer. The officers initially just sat in their station as I watched blood pool under this guy, spreading out. Finally, they came to check, and instantly everyone was screaming for medical help and for us to get back in our cells and lock down. It happened right in front of my cell. I saw them put him on the backboard. They were trying to cross his hands over his chest to buckle something but couldn't because his arms wouldn't stay up. In the aftermath, we learned he died. All 3 guys were pulled out and presumably charged with the beating. Life just went on as normal after. I forgot the important part. No one ever saw his paperwork, no one had it. They just thought he wasn't liked in another unit. They essentially just beat him and killed him because they wanted to. It's something that has stuck with me, especially because I was only in there because I couldn't afford bail of $500. Sorry for being so long. Story 31. I worked in prisons for a while, helping young convicts develop new skills before their release. One young man, about 20 years old, very articulate, intelligent, and humorous, was caught smuggling drugs at the airport. He left the airport without any problems but realized he had dropped his sunglasses. So he went back inside. He was caught by a sniffer dog. I do not condone his actions, but for a smart person, he understood how foolish it was to return for a pair of glasses. The look in his eyes when he told me was quite sad. I believe he received a sentence of about 6 years. Story 32. Ex-correctional officer for 10 years here. There is a situation that has stuck with me. About year 3, I was working second shift in the kitchen and a man, whose name I cannot remember, was giving me trouble. I responded in kind, and after some back and forth, he took it too far. I told him I would give him a 24-hour or 48-hour confinement for it if he continued. He said he did not. Care because he had court the next day, would be released, and could not wait to see his daughter. I checked the computer and confirmed he did indeed have court. I called him into the kitchen office and we talked. Essentially, I decided not to write him up, and we resolved the issue well enough. The next day, before my 12 p.m. kitchen shift, he was found dead behind a Cumberland Farms. After being released, he went to his old dealer, used drugs that were laced with fentanyl, and died instantly. Story 33. Guys, former drug users with human immunodeficiency virus receiving no medication and slowly deteriorating. When the doctor came to examine them, he stood 2 meters away, trying to shine a light into the patient's mouth. This occurred over 20 years ago in Bangkok. Story 34. My neighbor was locked up in juvenile detention when he was 12 for lighting an abandoned house on fire. Neighborhood kids would play in the house. It was in the woods and no one ever really went there, so they made it their fort. My friend wanted to join them, and they said he could join their club. They told him he could join if he got rid of a wasp's nest in one of the rooms. They gave him a lighter and a can of hairspray and told him to burn the nest. He didn't really want to do that, but he wanted to be their friend because they were a little older and basically the only other kids his age around. So he went in, found the wasp's nest, lit the lighter and sprayed the nest. Some curtains caught fire and eventually the whole house burned. When the police came, they all blamed him. While in juvenile detention, he was molested by one of the guards. He went in as a kid who just wanted some friends and came out a criminal. He stole cars, got in fights, and was never the same again. He was in and out of jails his whole life and passed away last year from a very treatable infection because he didn't get the care he needed until it was too late. The juvenile detention system seems to just wreck kids. There has to be a better way. Story 35. I am a corrections officer, and most things don't bother me because I have to come back every day. But one thing stands out. We had an inmate, we'll call him Johnny. Johnny had a mental disability that left him with the brain of an 8-year-old in the body of a 15-year-old, despite being in his mid-20s. Many things were wrong with him being here. Firstly, he should never have been arrested. His bail was $50, and his parents refused to pay it, instead taking a vacation to St. Martin. Every Thursday, visitation day for his cell block, he would come up to me and say, "Officer, my parents are here. Can I go see them?" I checked with the officers in the lobby, and no, they were not there. He just hoped that if he showed up, they might come. On Christmas Eve, he asked if Santa was still going to bring him presents even if he was in jail. Administration decided to place him in our special needs unit, which makes sense. However, our special needs unit is mostly comprised of sex offenders. We put a mentally handicapped man who looks 15 and acts 8 in a unit full of sex offenders. Do you know what happened? Think about how many times it continued to happen after being reported. This situation is very upsetting. Story 36. A man told me after he was arrested that all he could think about were his dogs. He said the police did not care when he told them that his dogs were home alone. He really hoped someone he knew or a neighbor would check on them, but he could not get a hold of anyone. It broke my heart, poor puppies. Story 37. An older man was about 6 months from release. He was an avid Christian and attended services every week. He loved walking the track, which is where he died. It was the middle of winter, near sub-zero temperatures with wind chill in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan one afternoon. The snow around the track was about waist-high after being cleared. He had apparently suffered a heart attack and fell beneath the snow berms, so no correctional officers could see him. He died shortly after. Story 38. Someone was convicted while the victim said it was not him. He received a 10-year sentence and died by suicide a year later. Story 39. Spent a few years in a juvenile detention center in Florida almost 20 years ago. A 15-year-old kid we called Paul Wall got to his release date, and the day he was leaving, he packed everything up and sat in the day room. We wished him well, hugged him, and then he just waited, sitting with his bag, and waited some more. The whole day went by, and we finally hit bedtime. I don't know how he didn't break down. I know he couldn't anyway, given the environment. But the kid was tough for that. His mother forgot to come pick him up, and she forgot for another week or so before someone finally came and got him. I honestly can't imagine how that completely shattered him mentally during those few days that probably felt like an eternity. I know he had looked at that day like the light at the end of the tunnel, like we all do, and that guarantee was shattered. He had no idea how much longer that nightmare was going to last. It shook me a little bit, and I'd be lying if I said it didn't. Up to that point, I had been under the understanding that they had to release you on your release day. It was crazy to think that my people might decide not to get me, and I'd just be stuck. Story 40. Sweet old man, Cuban, gentle unless you spoke badly about Castro, bottom tier, collapses in the day room behind our table where we were playing proxy magic. The gathering. My back was to him, so I did not see anything. Another person at the table noticed but said nothing for about 30 seconds. Another inmate passed by, nervously laughed, and asked the old man why he was lying on the ground. The man was completely unresponsive, and the rest of the table turned around. We shouted for the guard to come help him. The day room was closed, and we returned to our cells. For the next 20 minutes, all you could hear were the guards talking and some sort of machine sounding, compress, 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 and so on. Eventually, he was taken away, and the day room returned to normal. A week later, we saw him back, walking and talking. Apparently, this was not the first time. The person who said nothing, that was the sad part. He was banned from the table and eventually moved units since everyone blacklisted him. Story 41. The man who assaulted me in my cell and threatened to cut my throat broke down crying because he was tired of pretending to be tough. He was actually terrified and just wanted to be home with his children. That honestly affected me deeply. He was a high-ranking drug dealer. I couldn't believe that the man who threatened to cut my throat was now crying uncontrollably in my arms. It was the strangest moment of my life. Story 42. I was in juvenile detention back in the late 1970s in California. I watched a kid around 12 or 13 years old. He was really small, so we all just guessed his age. Kill an older kid before lights out. The older kid had been sexually abusing the younger one for a while, and the younger kid had had enough. He managed to get a weapon, which we assumed came from the guards since there was no way he made it himself, and attacked the older kid from behind. We all knew something was going to happen because, for weeks, you could see the younger kid was ready to snap. We figured it would be a bloodbath for him. He got lucky in the fight and knocked the older kid out cold, then proceeded to gouge out his eyes. He was like a surgeon, so fast about it. He also cut open the older kid's abdomen, exposing his intestines. It was gruesome. They had him committed to psychiatric care, and that was the last I saw or heard of him. Later searches showed he got out and eventually became a rather successful lawyer. I never knew or witnessed the sexual abuse directly, just lots of harassment all the time. I don't think it would have mattered much, as I had my own fears to deal with. I will never forget seeing eyeballs for the first time. Story 43. I was doing a stretch at Collins, New York State Correctional Facility, and my cellmate kept telling me that another inmate had it out for him because he harmed his brother. I spoke with the guy even though I had little influence in that place. I was just sick of hearing him whining into the early hours of the night. The guy straight up said he knew the other inmate was certified insane and had no conflict with him. I talked with him later that evening in hopes he would calm down. No. He then became convinced I was with them. He cut his own neck with a melted toothbrush. Spent 2 days in a coma before they took him off life support. Even though it's sad, I don't for a minute ask myself, what if? Because I already went to great lengths to accommodate him. Some people just are not right in the head. Story 44. I have seen everything. Murders, gang hits, suicides, rapes, theft, gang initiations. But the saddest was when I watched a younger man, aged 34 to 40, who was extremely healthy, have a massive stroke that he survived. The stroke left him unable to walk, with half of his body paralyzed. He could understand conversations but was unable to speak, though he would try. After about a year, he was able to walk to eat by himself using a walker. It was extremely sad, and I still think about that to this day. Story 45. My cellmate in juvenile detention was in for statutory rape at 15 years old. The girl was 3 months younger than him. It had more to do with the fact that he was from the trailer park and her father was on the city council. Anyway, someone he knew got arrested and came in. Apparently, his girlfriend had died by suicide 2 months earlier, and no one had informed him. Later in the cell, he suddenly got up and slammed his head against the cement walls in bed, splitting his skull open. I was put back to a green shirt because I was trying to restrain him while yelling for help. The guards took a long time to even check. I never knew what happened to him after that. I knew his first name was Shane, but not his last name. This was in the late 1980s, and I was 13 at the time. Story 46. Not as an inmate, but as a correctional officer, I saw a young man get killed, and it stayed with me. The young man was new and caught the attention of an older inmate. I suppose the young man was tired of being assaulted. So one day he attacked the older inmate with a blade he had secretly brought back from his job at a t-shirt silk screen shop. It looked like he landed a couple of good swings on the older inmate before the weapon was taken from him, but that was about it. The older inmate got the blade and nearly decapitated the young man before we arrived. The young man was dead before they even started medical treatment. I will never forget seeing them take the young man away, his head barely attached to his body. He could not have been more than 18 or 19 years old. Story 47. Not prison, but when I was in jail awaiting transfer to a new facility, there was a girl in my pod who had a colostomy. The medical staff either did not have or would not give her the bags and barrier strips she needed, so she would stuff the stoma with pads and toilet paper. I was also part of the Texas Treatment Institute. Unfortunately, we were all 14 to 18 years old at the time of these stories, which all took place at the same facility. Staff was notorious for using dirty restraints. They made sure to hurt us. I once got hit in the head with a walkie-talkie and my head was stepped on. They would use 5 staff members to restrain kids when it definitely was not needed. One day we were in science class and one of the girls, Q, started panicking. She wanted out immediately. She was not really aggressive but did try moving staff out of the way and pulling on the door handle. Ms. Z used a restraint technique called the chicken wing on her, which involves pulling someone's bent arm behind their back and pushing it up. However, she pushed Q's arm up to the point that it broke. It was an audible break and I gagged. We all silently panicked because if we freaked out, it would have been considered a riot. Q's scream was the first time I heard someone sound like an animal. "Oh my God, you broke my arm. My arm, you broke my arm." Her arm was dangling there, and she could not stop screaming. Ms. Z radioed for backup. They escorted us back to our cells while they took Q to the hospital. Ms. Z stayed on staff but could no longer work with our group after Q was transferred. There was a guy who was a day away from release. I honestly think he was scared of the outside world and did not know what to do. Being institutionalized is its own kind of hell. Our rooms, cells, and beds were being remodeled, and he took a piece of metal left behind by construction workers and stabbed a staff member. He was transferred to jail and was looking at prison time as far as I understand. This sticks with me because I was also scared to leave. Being institutionalized is truly its own kind of hell. There was a kid called Chop who I think had some kind of developmental disability, but he was sexually aggressive. He would masturbate in the group rooms and flash anyone who went by. There was a young therapist working there, and I do not know exactly what happened because he was on the boys' floor, but I know he sexually assaulted her. She left that same day and never came back. There was also a girl who was new and did not want to be there, so she would do anything to leave. That was not uncommon because some people wanted to be on the outside. They would hurt themselves to be taken to the hospital. This girl would swallow anything small, but most commonly swallowed batteries regularly. At one point, the staff ignored her to the point that she was throwing up blood. In that same facility, we had to routinely watch one another for self-harm or suicide attempts and perform restraints. There were times when I stayed up for hours watching my roommate to make sure they did not kill themselves. Staff did not care. On more than one occasion, our roommates attempted. I even attempted and had to be restrained once. It was horrendous. On one occasion, I had 2 roommates, C and S. S was suicidal, so C and I had to stay up in shifts in a sort of suicide watch. We were both heavily medicated, so eventually we dozed off. Later, I woke up to C screaming for help because S had attempted. She was trying to help S while I banged on the cell door for help. I screamed and banged on the metal door, which rattled loudly. I screamed that S had attempted and asked for help. Other girls on the floor also woke up and banged on doors, telling staff to stop ignoring us. The midnight staff ignored us and kept playing their music and laughing for some time before they came to help. They told S to settle and left. I guess S lost all her will to fight because she did not try again. Story 48. I knew a young man who went into federal prison at 18 for sexting with his boyfriend, who was not yet 18. They were both in high school. The parents found out, and this took place in rural Virginia. They were upset about the idea that their son was gay and called the authorities. Federal agents tried to charge him with production of child pornography but could not, so they charged him with receipt. He was still given 17 years in prison, plus lifetime supervision. You cannot tell me that this is an appropriate sentence for two teenagers sexting. Story 49. Taught college courses in a women's prison for a couple of years. One of my students told me, "I wasn't an addict until I got here. That broke my heart." She said drug use is so prevalent and easy to obtain there. Story 50. My stepfather was in prison for 8 years in Florida for vehicular manslaughter. He said there was an older man he knew who had been there for a few years. Apparently, he was a really nice man and minded his own business. This man was released, and my stepfather said he did not see him again until a few months later when he ran into him. He asked why he was back in prison, and the older man said he did not know how to really do anything. He said he could not get an apartment or a job due to his prison time and was essentially living on the street since he did not really have family. So he stole a few things from a store, made a big show of it, then stole a lady's purse on the way out. Then he just sat in a park and waited for the police to show up and arrest him. He literally could not function without prison, so he decided to get himself locked back up so he could at least have 3 meals and a bed. Since then, I cannot help but think about how terrible that is. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.